Hey everyone, we have been talking about the elements of a formal paragraph. As you probably remember, I kind of gave you the analogy of looking at it as a hamburger. That way you can remember all of the ingredients or the elements that you need to include to have a well-written paragraph. Today, I wanted to show you an example of what that looks like in practice. So on my screen here, I have pulled up the elements of a paragraph slide that I've showed you in the past to show you all of the elements that you need to include. And then on the right side of my screen, I have an example essay, and together we're going to mark the different elements that we see present there. So just as a reminder, the elements of a paragraph are as follows. We should first start our paragraph with a thesis statement or a topic sentence. That's just kind of like our roadmap to let our audience know what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the paragraph. Then for our middle of the hamburger, we have to have our leadoffs and we have to have 2 follow-ups for each leadoff. Just to have a well-written paragraph, it's best to have at least 3 leadoffs and then, like I said, 2 follow-ups for each. And then lastly, we also need to conclude our paragraph, and so we have to include a conclusion. So now let's revisit the example that I have here on the right side of my screen. So just a reminder for you, when you type your essay should look just like this, except for obviously you wouldn't have a key because you won't need to label your paragraph. That's just there for today's video. So as a reminder, you need to have an MLA header. Your MLA header should look like this. You should have your name, your teacher's name, the class name, and then the date. Okay, then right after our header, we should also have our title. Now keep in mind, your title does not need to be bolded. It does not need to be extra large. It doesn't have to be underlined. It's actually going to be the same font and the same font size as the rest of the essay. So the title doesn't need to look big and special. And then obviously we have our body paragraph here. Another thing that you'll probably notice is the entire document has been written in Times New Roman font and it's font size 12. So again, that's what your paragraph should look like as well when it's all typed up. So now, for the sake of this activity, I am going to just walk you through the colors that I selected for my key. I am going to highlight my thesis in red. My transitions will be marked as yellow. I will mark my leadoffs as green. All of my supporting details will be blue, and then my conclusion will be purple. Okay, so let's begin by reading this paragraph together. The paragraph says, "The most interesting parts in Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None are the characters, the settings, and the surprise element through a poem. First, the most interesting part of this book is the characters. These characters are interesting because they all have been invited to the same place for different reasons. The characters are also interesting because they all have been accused of committing a horrible crime. Second, the setting is an interesting part of this novel. The setting of this novel is intriguing because it takes place on a mysterious island that has been bought by an unknown host. The setting is also intriguing because this island is close enough to the land that the characters can see the neighboring town, but it's far enough away that the characters are stranded on the island. Lastly, the poem in this novel adds an exciting twist to the story. The poem is interesting because, on the surface, it seems like just a rhyme that tells a simple story. However, by the end of the 3rd chapter, we find out that the poem plays a bigger role in the story. In conclusion, the characters, the setting, and the poem are some of the most intriguing parts of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None." So now let's label these parts together. So like I have showed you on our slide here, our paragraph must begin with a thesis statement. So that's actually probably the easiest one for us to highlight. So I am going to grab my first sentence here, and I'm going to turn that red. This very first sentence is my thesis statement. And remember, a thesis statement is one sentence that has 2 parts. Part 1, I'm going to tell my audience what my topic is. The topic is interesting parts in a book. The second part will list all my 3 leadoffs, or my main ideas. Okay, and that's when I talk about the characters, the setting, and the poem. Next, keep in mind that every leadoff should be introduced by some sort of transition. I know that my transition words are words like first, second, third, and so actually I'm going to identify all of those now. So I have my first transition here, my second transition down here, a third transition here, and then I know that my conclusion must also begin with a concluding transition, and that's what I've done on my last sentence here. So now I have identified all of my transitions, and this is actually going to help me identify where the leadoffs are. Remember, transitions introduce a leadoff, so that must mean that the sentences right after the transitions will be my leadoffs. I have a leadoff here, a leadoff here, and a leadoff here. Now remember, your leadoffs are going to relist your main ideas, the ideas or the points that you're trying to make. If we wanted to check our work, we could compare our leadoffs with our thesis statement. So in my thesis statement, the first idea that I list is my characters. As you can see from the green text, I also mention characters as my first leadoff sentence. The same goes for the second item I list in my thesis, which is the setting. If I check my work, the setting is listed in my thesis, and it's also listed as my second leadoff. And the same goes for my last main idea in my thesis, which I talk about the poem. If we look at my last leadoff, I'm talking about the poem again. So again, remember when I said that the thesis statement is kind of like the roadmap of the essay? It lets my audience know exactly what I'm going to be talking about in what order I'll talk about them. And then as we talked about, we also need to have at least 2 follow-up sentences for every leadoff. Remember, the follow-ups just explain what I mean by that. So it just gives more detail, more explanations. So if we look at our first leadoff, I'm talking about the characters in the story. So now these next 2 sentences talk about what I mean by those interesting characters. I talk about how they're all invited to the island for different reasons, and then I also talk about how they're interesting because they've all been invited and accused of committing a horrible crime. So I explain what I mean by them being very interesting. So I have 2 sentences there for that leadoff, so I'm going to highlight those blue. Next, for my second leadoff, I have 2 sentences again, 1 and 2, that explain what I mean by the second leadoff. Again, the second leadoff talks about it being an interesting part of the story, and that's the setting. So I explain what I mean by that in my next 2 follow-ups. My follow-ups say that the setting is an interesting part of the novel because it's on a mysterious island that's owned by an unknown host. And then it's also intriguing because it's close enough that they can see a neighboring town, but far enough away that they're stranded. So again, I need to have at least 2 sentences that explain what I mean by this leadoff. And then lastly, I have my third leadoff, which I talk about the poem, and I have 2 sentences, 1 and 2, that explain why that poem is so interesting. So again, I'll mark those blue to show that they're my leadoffs. And then lastly, as we know, we need to have some sort of conclusion. And the conclusion is going to summarize what we've just talked about by restating our thesis. So I know that the conclusion is the last part of my paragraph, and so I'm going to highlight that purple. So now again, I just wanted to show you what all of these elements look like in practice. So this paragraph is simply an example of all of these elements that we've talked about in the past. So when you write your first paragraph for me, I want you to be really intentional about including these elements because these elements will result in a really well-written paragraph. If you have any questions about anything that I've talked to you about in this video, don't hesitate to reach out. Bye everyone.